Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this. I'm Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. It's a great pleasure, and on behalf of the faculty and staff in our center, to welcome you to this year's Miller-Converse lecture. Our speaker today is absolutely appropriate for this honor of giving this lecture, and also appropriate for this moment in contemporary American politics, and indeed in politics all over the world. Nick Valentino will introduce Stanley in a moment. This occasion celebrates the careers of Warren Miller and Phil Converse, two giants in the development of modern social science and in the development of this institution, ISR, here at Michigan. Warren and Phil, of course, were two of the so-called four horsemen who wrote The American Voter, a seminal book in behavioral political science. They were young when that book was written, and if that was all they did, they would earn the right to have a lecture named after them, not to mention the various scholarships and fellowships and other honors around the profession named after them. But they did so much more, each of them, including writing many books and articles that established new directions in research. Both continued to write on voting decisions and political attitudes, making many groundbreaking advancements. Phil, with his famous 1964 article on mass publics, established with that one article several areas of research on political knowledge, on ideology, and on non-attitudes. Warren, with his famous research on representation and his moving in comparative directions to broaden the study of voting behavior and attitudes. Both of them, in fact, worked on data from other countries and also became interested in elite attitudes. Both of them were institution builders. Warren with the ICPSR and also with our own center, CPS. Phil with the broader ISR and the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. They understood the value of public goods and institutions in research, in the creation of knowledge, in the training and teaching of students, in the kind of spillover effects that excellence in research has on other parts of campuses, on the community, and in our country. It is interesting to me to consider how Warren and Phil would have studied this moment of deep polarization. We can imagine and we can wonder, but I say, wait a minute. Maybe what we need to do is acknowledge the fields of inquiry they created, the works that they spawned, the people who are writing on polarization, including our speaker, follow in a tradition, not just of topic, but of method and of a focus on precision and excellence in data analysis. Maybe we can stop wondering what if and just say, well, look what we have in our midst, in the audience and in our speaker. Outstanding scholarship that Warren and Phil might have done themselves. That's the beauty of the legacies of these two people. We don't need to imagine, we can rather appreciate what we have in people like our speaker today. Warren and Phil were more than willing to weigh in on the big questions of the day. And we continue to make headway with their legacies, thanks to them and thanks to people like our speaker today. Nick Valentino will now introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ken. I'm Nick Valentino. I'm a political scientist and a research professor in the Center for Political Studies. I'm also currently serving as one of the PIs of the American National Election Study. It's very exciting, first of all, for us to be doing this lecture in person again. I remember there's a few of us that are almost exactly in my cohort as a professor that I know will remember this, that we got here in the late 90s, and this is when this lecture started. And this spring lecture marked like such an exciting time for all of us as young faculty to come to the Miller-Converse lecture. And that was marks the end of the year, but also we would see all of these people who we'd read as as graduate students and as undergraduates in the same room, and the audience was filled with these dignitaries, and it was just a very exciting thing. So thank goodness we can all be back in person. And I'm grateful to Ken for allowing me to introduce Stanley. So I'm deeply honored to introduce our speaker, Stanley Feldman of Stony Brook University, to deliver the Miller-Converse Lecture of 2023. It's an honor for professional reasons, since Stanley's work is deeply tied to the American National Election Study. He's been both an active user of the data in his published work, but also a perennial contributor to the field of political methodology and in survey measurement in particular. So again, I echo Ken's statement that there couldn't be a better person to have in this series. I'm also really pleased that Stanley's here because I'm lucky to call him a really good friend and a fellow traveler in the discipline, and also a fellow traveler in the world, since he and I have worked and served the International Society for Political Psychology. I'm hoping someone will ask him over dinner how it is exactly we found ourselves attending a Scottish family reunion of the Clan MacLean on the Isle of Mull in 2017. And I think that the answer has a lot to do with the charisma of his partner, Leonie Huddy, who's also another speaker in this series. Stanley is the author of an important monograph on emotion and political communication. He's got another important monograph on the way, which I've been, and many of us, anxiously anticipating, on authoritarianism. Two very useful sage green books on political methodology, over 60 peer-reviewed papers and chapters in edited volumes. His work's been cited over 23,000 times in Google Scholar. He's a long-serving member of ISPP, as I mentioned, including as its president in 2013 and 2014. He's been a member of the ANES Advisory Board, when we refer to it as the Board of Overseers, before we changed the politically incorrect title. And I guess one of the things I admire most about him is that he's got this generous spirit to take up many of our most important and influential concepts in our discipline, the ones that sit at the center of our theories, and sharpen their definitions, improve the way we measure them, advance our important and influential theories about public opinion formation and change in democracies. One of his major intellectual contributions is the measurement and understanding of political ideology, its dimensionality, where it comes from, and how it influences public opinion and political behavior. A second contribution comes in his development of a measure of authoritarianism that is both valid and reliable, especially compared to its predecessors. It's a major improvement over the F scale. If he won't say it, I'll definitely say it. He probably will say it. The now famous Feldman child rearing scale on authoritarianism is the most widely used scale of this concept in political science. He's used this tool to advance scholarship on authoritarianism for decades now, and has understood better, in my opinion, than others, the relationship between exposure to political threats and the expression of authoritarian predispositions. I also really have to mention, there's a paper that he wrote with his brilliant co-author Pam Conover that really helped introduced to political science the idea of cognitive schemas, what they are, how people use them to organize the political world in their memories, and with what consequences for decisions and behavior. I'm a huge fan of that work. He's improved on the measurement of emotion, values, political tolerance, trust in government, mass economic forecasting, basic issue preferences, political empathy. This is not an exhaustive list. So some of you, I'm sure most of you know, but you might be forgiven for not knowing how foundational Feldman's work is. The impact is very broad substantively. And so, but also because Stanley's rather modest and understated, I think, as a person, until you get to know him. It's as if he remains unaware of that old academic saying, quote, "He who tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted," unquote. But if you work in public opinion and survey research, whether you know it or not, you have used Feldman's insights. You have deployed his measures and you've benefited from his advice, both theoretical and methodological. I just want to say one final thing that really impresses me about Feldman's impact, which is his list of former PhD students, and he's got more on the way. It's really a literal who's who of political psychology, and that includes Pazit Ben-Nun, Aaron Cassis, Chris Johnston, Lily Mason, Marco Steenburgen, Karen Stenner, Nada Turkleton, Julie Ronsky, Chris Weber, and many others. Needless to say, we are all in Professor Feldman's debt, and to the extent that we see very far, we do it by standing on his shoulders. So let's welcome him as the 2023 Miller-Converse Lecturer.
Thank you, Nick. Not sure I can live up to that, so hopefully I won't let you all down. It's really an honor to be invited here, and particularly meaningful for me. When I was a very green assistant professor, I get an email from Don Kinder, said, would you like to join a planning committee for an upcoming NES pilot study? And so what could I say? Of course, I say yes. So the first meeting is in Tempe, Arizona. And so I fly into Phoenix, get a ride to the beautiful Fiesta Inn, and have instructions for the first evening to meet outside to be transported to dinner. And I walk out the door and stop, and the first two people I see standing there are Warren Miller and Phil Converse. And I still remember saying to myself at that point something to the effect of, what am I doing here? I think I said it more colorfully, but you can imagine. But it turned out that Warren and Phil were extremely welcoming of someone who felt out of place. Phil didn't come to very many meetings, so I'm sorry I didn't get to know him better. But as Nick indicated, I transitioned from planning committee to what was then the ANES Board of Overseers for a number of years. So I got to know Warren much better. And I always thought that Warren was really supportive of a young political psychologist whose work I wasn't really sure that he fully appreciated. But despite that, he was always encouraging. And then toward the end of my term on the board, we're again meeting in Tempe, and we're at dinner, and I'm sitting next to Warren, and he's telling me about this book he's working on with Merrill Shanks, elaborating on the funnel of causality. And he says, and I'll let you know that the value scales that you've added to the election study are going to be central to our analysis. And I remember thinking, well, all these years, so he actually did appreciate what I was doing, but it took that moment for it to click. So I'm really honored to be able to speak at this event. It was right about that same time as I was finishing my term on the ANES board that the germination for this project began. I was working on the last of the election studies that I was tasked with on the NES board, which was the 1992 election study. And 1992 election turned out to be more interesting than people thought, at least for someone like me, because a candidate appeared on the scene who was saying things and using rhetoric that we typically hadn't seen at that point in American politics, right? And so these are just some direct quotes. Some of this might sound familiar. Put America first. We don't want America dumped into some landfill called multiculturalism. We have to get control of our border. We have to build a fence across the Mexican border. American worker is forced to compete with Mexican labor and Chinese labor, the like. And so if you read this and you think, was Donald Trump trying out his message back in 1992? The answer is no. And it was, in fact, this guy, Pat Buchanan. And so Pat Buchanan was challenging George H.W. Bush in the Republican primaries that year. Gave him a bit of scare in New Hampshire. Obviously, Bush won handily, although I think it's worth remembering that Buchanan in 1992 won almost 25% of the Republican primary vote that year. Maybe we should have taken more notice of that back then, but nobody did. So it turned out that while watching and listening to Buchanan, I was also reading some recent literature that had started to come out on authoritarianism in psychology. Authoritarianism research in psychology has gone through waves, but by the late 80s and early 90s, it was making something of a resurgence, but almost entirely in psychology. So I was sort of thinking about why this construct wasn't more interesting to political scientists. And I started doing a little work on it. And I developed a short scale. And so I wrote up a memo and suggested that partly because of Buchanan's rhetoric, it might be interesting to include a short measure of authoritarianism on the election study, and the board agreed. And so the measure was included. I wrote a couple of papers. I thought it worked well, it looked valid, but political scientists still weren't interested. Right? It was 1990s. With the fall of the Soviet Union, authoritarianism did not seem like a very interesting topic. And remember, the narrative at that time was the victory of liberal democracy. And so I moved on, despite my best efforts at the time. Fast forward about 15 years, right? And all of a sudden, stories like this are popping up in the press and political press. And now people are talking about authoritarianism. So basically, what I want to talk to you about today is how we got from where I started in 1992 to actually this and now. And how do we get to a point where nobody thought at least political scientists didn't think authoritarianism was very interesting, to the point where journalists were picking up on, what's going on here and how does this explain what's happening in American politics. So in order to do this, I want to back up and talk a little bit about the concept of authoritarianism, because it is either poorly understood or misunderstood, and it causes a lot of confusion. And it probably is a bad label for the concept, but it has been around for decades. So I don't think there's any point at this point at changing it. Research on authoritarianism, as most people know, began in the late 1930s, 1940s. Directly as a response to an attempt to understand why a portion of Germans supported Hitler and the Nazis. An early publication was a book by Erich Fromm, published back in 1941, Escape from Freedom. I think still a book that's worth reading, and it has been underappreciated since then. 1950 saw the publication of the 1,000-page work, The Authoritarian Personality, which really caused the field to take off. And then in 1988, a Canadian social psychologist, Bob Altmeyer, published a book, Enemies of Freedom, which revisited the construct, developed a new measure. And this was sort of the point at which I'm viewing this from 1992, because Altmeyer's work causes psychologists to start revisiting the concept of authoritarianism, seeing more publications on it. And I was thinking, what could we make of this? But there are some real problems due to the history of authoritarianism research. So I want to establish exactly what I'm talking about here. Despite the fact that there are thousands and thousands of published works on authoritarianism, there are still some really fundamental issues. Like, what is it, right? You would think we throw around this term constantly, we know what it is, but over its history, it has been labeled a personality characteristic. It's been described as a cluster of attitudes. It's been called a worldview. And so depending on who you read, you have a very different definition of the term. But even more problematic for us, there's something wrong with or missing rather, from a lot of psychological treatments of authoritarianism. On the one hand, authoritarianism is seen to be a relatively stable trait, right? We don't expect it to go up and down over time within individuals, right? But that leaves us with a real problem, which is why at some points in time, do we not observe much, if any, effect of authoritarian predispositions on politics, and why at other points are we seeing people speculate about the effect of authoritarianism on vote and partisanship? So something must be missing that helps us link the trait to politics and answers the question which political scientists need to address, which is why, if it is a relatively stable predisposition, why it appears to be politically relevant at some points, politically potent, and other points we don't observe any effect of it. So what I want to suggest is that there has been developing over the last 15 to 20 years a better conceptualization of authoritarianism that helps us get around some of these problems. And one way to think about this is to sort of look at what we think are the typical characteristics of people high in authoritarianism. Opposition to diversity, hostility to feminism, support for traditional values, nationalism, etc. So what puts these things together? So the traditional answer has been punitiveness, right? This is sort of, if you strip away everything, it's like, these are just angry, intolerant, prejudiced people looking for outgroups to denigrate. And that's the end of the story. But if that's the end of the story, then we shouldn't see it come and go, because these people we should observe the same behavior all the time. So somehow punitiveness doesn't seem to answer the question. So let me suggest another answer, which is that we can see all of these things as a way of enforcing social conformity with what are considered to be the norms and values and practices of members of the majority group. That each of these things can be seen as defending the norms and values of the in-group, and at the same time punishing when necessary people who don't conform to those norms and values, or people who threaten the social cohesion of the in-group. So what I want to show is, if we think about it this way, we can in fact derive some interesting predictions about when it should be manifested and what the consequences should be. But that still leaves open one big question. So if this is heading in the right direction, then why do some people act this way? And the answer I suggest is that at its heart, the authoritarian continuum really reflects an inherent tension in both society and individuals in terms of social cohesion and social control. Right? There's how much do societies need to enforce common norms, common behaviors, common values in order to have in-group cooperation. Right? What we need to recognize is that humans are social creatures. To the extent to which we have accomplished what we've done is because we work in groups. So group cooperation is critical. Social cohesion is important. And And you can see that having common norms, common values, and protecting those are going to be important, but it comes at a cost. To the extent to which we enforce social conformity, we reduce the possibility for individual freedom and autonomy. Right? So at some point, there has to be a trade-off, right? There has to be a trade-off. And societies have different points along this continuum, and we can recognize societies that allow people much more freedom and societies that much less freedom. But my argument is that even if people don't think about this consciously, they have some intuition for where they fall on this continuum. And so what I would suggest is a useful way to think about the underlying predisposition is it's where on this continuum bounded by wanting social conformity, obedience, and respect for authority versus personal autonomy, freedom, and independence do people feel most comfortable. If we have a measure of this trade-off with enough variance, what we typically find is that the distribution of people on this is roughly normal. Probably not surprising. And most people think we need some of both and that we need to balance that off, right? But there are people, and I talk about this later if people are interested, who really lean towards the social conformity end of this continuum, just as there are people who lean toward the personal autonomy end of the continuum. And so my argument is that we can understand the dynamics of authoritarianism by understanding how people navigate the trade-off between these values. And my argument is that even if people don't think that they're doing this, they have some position on this, and I'll show you that. So let me talk a little bit more about the construct, because I think I think it is misunderstood. Authoritarianism, or at least the values of social conformity and tradition and norms and the like, are in fact can in fact be functional. They help groups. They help support group cohesion. They encourage cooperation, and so it is easy to see how societies could benefit from some degree of social conformity and support for norms and values. It can be functional. But at the same time, when people start to perceive threats to social cohesion, threats to in-group values, right, it's going to activate a response among people high in this authoritarianism dimension to defend, to double down, defend in-group norms, punish transgressors, punish those people who they see as threatening group cohesion and who are nonconformists. So something that under some circumstances can be useful for society can also under other circumstances turn around and cause a great deal of conflict. So let me make a point, because this is going to shape what I talk about from this point on. This conceptualization of authoritarianism is intimately bound up with group norms and values. And so to understand authoritarianism, you have to always understand it within the context of group members, right? The effects of authoritarianism are going to be different for members of majority groups as opposed to minority groups. And so so that I can finish this talk in time for dinner, I'm only going to focus on white Americans in this talk. If anybody wants to ask me about authoritarianism among African Americans, Latinos afterwards, I'm happy to talk about that. But if I incorporate that, I'll never get through this. So from this point on, this is basically about authoritarianism among white Anglo-Americans. So let me come back to the question I started with. So what accounts for the fact that authoritarianism appears to be much more politically relevant now than 30 years ago. It's certainly not that, as I mentioned, that authoritarianism levels are any higher in the US than they were 30 years ago. If anything, they're actually down slightly, but there's certainly been no increase. So it's not like Americans have all of a sudden become more authoritarian. There are two major factors that I want to point to. One is perceived social threat, and the other is elite messaging. And I think it's the combination of the two of those that have produced what we're seeing today. So first point, as I mentioned, authoritarian predispositions may be relatively benign, assuming that members of the group don't feel under threat, right? So social threat is necessary to activate authoritarianism. And what's been happening in the US over certainly the last 20, 25 years, but social change on many dimensions, right? Immigration, growth of minority groups, changes in gender norms, secularization. Any one of these things could pose a threat to people high in authoritarianism. What we've been seeing is a confluence of things that could be threatening social cohesion for some whites in the U.S. I often think that if you were designing an experimental study to activate authoritarianism and you included all of these elements, somebody would say, you're just going overboard. This is too much. But in fact, this is the reality of what people are dealing with. Now, this is all real, but I think it's also important to recognize that the media and elites can magnify this threat, right? And that's also been happening. So we see this great replacement theory, right? Grooming, critical race theory, and my favorite at the moment, woke, right? And in this context, you can see all of those things as shortcuts for just sending signals, right? That there are big threats out there, right? And that these threats are challenges for group cohesion, traditional values, et cetera. So the social change is real, right? I don't think we can ignore that. But we also have to take into account that elites and media can and do amplify that message to make the world seem even more threatening to some people. Okay, so that's one part of the story. The other is elite signaling. So I have to have this slide because I'm at Michigan, right? And Don Kinder's sitting right there. So one of the most well demonstrated findings in political behavior literature is just the enormous variance across the public in political attentiveness, knowledge, sophistication, and the like. And obviously, this goes back to Phil-Converse's classic 1964 paper. But we also know since then that sophistication information help people to provide linkages from their predispositions to issue preferences. Think of John Zoller's book, which demonstrates that very nicely. And in fact, the same thing should hold for authoritarianism. And Chris Federico wrote a paper several years ago that demonstrated that authoritarianism behaves exactly this way. The effect of authoritarianism in his data from about 10 or 15 years ago was much stronger among people with college degree than with people without, which is totally consistent with this. But to some extent, being able to make a connection between your predispositions and political preferences, vote choice, issue preferences and the like, is going to depend upon how loud the signal is, right? Everyone knew about 9/11, right? Everyone knew about, quickly discovered what was happening in January 6th in the Capitol a couple of years ago, right? There are just some things that get broadcast so loudly that they even manage to get down through this hierarchy of sophistication. and knowledge. And so under those circumstances, even less attentive people should be able to increasingly connect their level of authoritarianism to political issues, voting and partisanship. And in part, we can see the parties helping them out, right? So just think that over the past 25 to 30 years, the issues that have increasingly been dividing Democratic and Republican Party are not the sort of traditional social welfare, small government issues, although that obviously hasn't completely gone away, but abortion, religion, gay rights, legalization of marijuana, immigration, transgender rights, et cetera. So the parties are increasingly sending signals to people that this is what partisan debate is about. So that should help get the message through to people, even those who are less attentive, and allow them to figure out how their high or low levels of authoritarianism link to politics. But one step further, and that particular leaders in particular elections can obviously help also broadcast this message. And I couldn't stand here without talking about Donald Trump as we're talking about authoritarianism. His particular campaign in 2016 emphasized all of those issues of social change that people had been concerned about. And if you want to see what authoritarian rhetoric really looks like, go back and read Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the 2016 Republican convention. It's just a classic. You couldn't have written a speech that signaled more clearly to people high in authoritarianism. It is dark. It is full of threats. It talks about the need for a powerful leader to get us out of this problem and the like. So there's no question that the 2016 and 20 elections should have helped activate authoritarianism, even among people who weren't paying much attention. But I want to point to one other election, and that's the 2004 election. You might not think George Bush, the kinder, gentler Republican conservative, but the 2004 election was interesting. It was on the heels of 9/11 terrorist attack. That terrorist attack upped the volume on anti-Muslim rhetoric in the US. And also, it's hard to remember now, but the Republican Party in the couple of years leading up to 2004 thought that it was strategically advantageous to get their voters out by encouraging states to have state referendums to ban gay marriage, right? So they sent a very strong signal about their opposition to gay marriage. So I want to also focus on the 2004 election and not just 2016 and 20. Okay, so let's get to some data. As Nick mentioned, there have been measures of authoritarianism for decades. The most commonly used one still in psychology is the one developed by Bob Altmaier in his 1988 book, The Right-Wing Authoritarianism Scale. And for people who haven't seen it, that's just a handful of questions. And if you look at them, you'd say, that looks great. I mean, that looks like authoritarian rhetoric, right? People agree with those, you would say, have authoritarian predispositions. The problem is they're too good, right? And so the problem is that as more politicians and media people say things that sound like this, we as political scientists lose the ability, if we find a relationship between scores on a measure like this and presidential voting, to say whether or not that correlation indicates that people high in authoritarianism prefer certain candidates, or that people who prefer certain candidates have in fact learned to say these sorts of things because that's what they hear from their candidate or that's what they hear from news. So this gets back to that measure that Nick talked about and that I proposed to the ANES board in 1992. And basically what I wanted to do was get back to this intention that I talked about between social conformity and autonomy and think about how to measure that in a relatively unobtrusive way. And what I thought was that if people had a trade-off between these values, it should also affect the values that they preferred for raising children, because after all, how do we get adults to have values that we want? We raise children that way. And so the measure is very simple. For those of you who haven't seen it, there's a preamble about people think that various values are important, but if you have to choose which one do you think is most important for a child to have, independence or respect for elders, obedience or self-reliance, be considerate or well-behaved, curious or good manners, and the expectation is people high in authoritarianism should prefer respect for elders over obedience. They should prefer respect for elders over independence, obedience over self-reliance, being well-behaved over being considerate, and having good manners over curiosity. That went into 1992 ANES. It disappeared in 1996. I wasn't around anymore. I actually didn't expect to see it again. To my surprise, it reappeared in 2000, and I've never quite understood why.
I did it.
Don did it.
I did it.
Okay.
People didn't want it. And when you brought it, I said, no.
Okay. So I now I finally know.
You owe me a dinner.
I do. Or at least a drink. So it reappeared in 2000 and then has been in every election study since then. So we have now, with the exception of 1996, this fairly long time series of election studies from 1992 to 2020 with these questions on them. It is quite stable, as authoritarianism is supposed to be. And so what does the distribution look like? This is just from the most recent ANES 2020. These are just white respondents. And 0 is basically all of the autonomy questions. So that's low in authoritarianism. 4 is 4 out of 4 choices of the authoritarian value option. So you can see there is a distribution. People do have definite stable preferences. About a third of whites are high on authoritarianism. Good number low, but about a third of whites are high on authoritarianism. Now, some people are skeptical that a measure like this could tap authoritarianism. So let me just give you 2 quick demonstrations. So these items were on the 2016 ANES. And again, they have nice face validity as sort of measure of authoritarian tendencies, desire for strong leader, in-group conformity, and the like. And so just estimated a simple 2-factor model, these items, 1 factor, the 4 child rearing items, other factor, and you look at the correlation between the 2 and it's 0.77. They're not exactly the same thing, but the 4 child rearing items correlate very highly with responses to these items. Second quick demonstration. This is just a simple crosstab. So I'm just going to show you among white Americans in the 2020 NES, the percentage of people at each level of authoritarianism who voted for Donald Trump. And it extends from 18% at the lowest end to 80% among people high. All right, so not quite as good as partisanship, but right up there in terms of predictors. Okay, so let me show you what's happened over time, and I'm going to do this in 3 ways. I'm going to show you that attitudes have become more correlated with authoritarianism over time, that authoritarianism has had an increasing effect on presidential vote, and that there is increasing sorting of partisanship along authoritarianism lines. And I'm going to keep emphasizing this because I think this is important, that that the increase, my hypothesis about the increase in in authoritarian rhetoric and difference between the parties has made it possible even for people less attentive to connect their authoritarianism to politics. Okay, so political attitudes. So for this, I took all of what I thought were the attitudes, political and social attitudes that would be most relevant to authoritarianism that were repeated exactly the same way in ANES studies from 1992 to 2020, and basically did a simple one-factor model for each year, anchored by the 4 child-rearing items. So their measurement parameters don't change over all those elections, and allow these issues to have variable loadings over time, right? And quite a range of issues that I was able to tap here. And so in a one-factor model, the factor loading is essentially the correlation between the attitude and the authoritarianism factor. So what I'm just going to show you is what the mean correlation looks like from each election from 92 to 2020, separately for people who have a college degree and people who don't, right? And it looks like that. And the basic thrust is it just goes up, right? Except for a couple of minor blips. The trend lines are consistently up, showing that over time, those 9 attitudes on average are becoming more correlated with authoritarianism. What's a little harder to see is that the trend line in blue for people with less than a college education is steeper than the line for people with a college education. So if you look back in 1992, you would say, this is exactly what we find for everything, right? Attitude constraint on everything is higher for people with a college degree than people with not. But then by the time you get to 2020, it is still slightly the case that there's more constraint, authoritarianism constraint among people with a college degree, but people with less than a college degree are quickly catching up, right? The difference has been reduced quite substantially. So attitudes over time are just increasingly coming into alignment with authoritarian predispositions, making it easier for candidates, right, to locate themselves consistently on this dimension because it taps into so many salient attitudes. Authoritarianism, presidential voting, just going to show you predicted values from a very simple model predicting vote choice, Democratic, Republican, 1992 to 2020 from authoritarianism, and controls for education, age, gender, religion, a couple of other things. And I'm just going to show you the predicted probability of voting Republican for people who scored highest and lowest on that measure. And it looks like this. So if you look in 1992, there's a modest effect of authoritarianism, right? People highest in authoritarianism probability of 0.62 voting Republican compared to people low in authoritarianism probability of 0.38. It goes up a bit between 92 and 2000. We don't have that missing 1996, so we don't know exactly what happens over those 8 years. But notice the bump in 2004, right? So 2004, now people high in authoritarianism are way beyond probability of voting Republican compared to where they were just a couple of elections ago in 1992. But something interesting happens, right? So we see this bump, and then comes the recession, and Republican presidential candidates John McCain and Mitt Romney, who would hardly or models of authoritarian leaders. And what happens? The effect of authoritarianism dips down, and now it's back down to where it was pre-2004. Right? So without the cues, right, the effect of authoritarianism starts to diminish. Right? And then, of course, we get to 2016 and 2020, in which we get to that slide that I showed you with the predicted probability that people high in authoritarianism voting for Trump of better than 0.8, right? Now, What happens when we look at this by education? So to simplify things, I'm now going to convert this to marginal effects so that the effects now can be interpreted as essentially the difference in probability of voting Republican for people highest in authoritarianism compared to lowest authoritarianism. So high scores are more of an effect of authoritarianism. So it looks like this. You should ignore 2000. The white sample in 2000 was fairly small. And when you divide it by college, as you can see, the estimates are totally imprecise. So I don't believe that. But if you look back at 1992, again, you can see what we always expect. The effect of authoritarianism, any predisposition on vote, is substantially larger for people with a college degree than people without. And ignoring 2000, through 2012, the effect of authoritarianism, marginal effect, is about 2.5 times for college educated voters what it was for people with less than a college education. And then the marginal effects start to get closer in 2016, and then we get to 2020. And again, the marginal effect of authoritarianism on vote in 2020 is still a little larger for people with a college education, but not much, right? So if you look at this compared to this, you just see a huge steep increase in the extent to which people with less than a college degree are connecting authoritarian predispositions to the vote. And finally, and this might be the most important thing, because as I showed you, the effect of authoritarianism can go up and down in votes, right? You get John McCain, and he doesn't appeal to authoritarians. Mitt Romney is not a Republican candidate that appeals to authoritarians. So things can go up. So effects can go up and down. But we think that partisanship locks people in. And so effects on partisanship are in some ways more important. So what's happened? And so basically what this is for people highest in authoritarianism, the probability that they identify as a Republican from 1992 to 2020. And if you look in 1992, you see a really interesting result, which is that there's no difference in mean authoritarianism between the two parties in 1992, right? That may seem odd, but if that's what the world looked like, if you randomly selected a Democratic identifier in 1992 and randomly selected a Republican, you have the same probability of finding someone who is authoritarian. Right? That starts to change over time. And again, it looks like it's bumping up in 2004, but then diminishing and then increasing. And then this is the really dramatic effect. Look at 2020. The predicted probability that someone highest in authoritarianism is a Republican identifier is 0.7 compared to the probability that they're a Democratic identifier of 0.1. This is just the effect for low authoritarians, which I'll skip over. Again, what I want to show you is the effect by education, because I think this is a critical part of the story. And again, notice in back even 1992, when there wasn't a mean difference, it was still the case that college-educated people who were high in authoritarianism figured out that they were more comfortable as a Republican than a Democrat. And notice, hardly any effect for Republicans, for less than college-educated. College-educated voters, authoritarians responded quite strongly to 2004, right? But it was temporary. And then 2016, and now look at 2020, there's no significant difference in the predicted probability that someone with and without a college degree who's high in authoritarianism identifies as a Republican, right? That is, people without a college degree, authoritarians without a college degree have figured out the connection between their predispositions, their attitudes, and Republican identification to the exact same degree that attentive college-educated voters have. Okay. So let me try to sum up. It's not always the case that authoritarianism has an impact on politics. The results for the early part of the series show that there was a weak link between authoritarianism and partisanship, some effect on vote, but not an enormous effect on vote. So when people don't feel threatened, when parties don't divide on these sorts of issues, then authoritarians don't behave distinctively. Back in the 1990s, many people high in authoritarianism turned out to be supportive of social safety net economic policies. That's not true today, since most high authoritarians have sorted into the Republican Party, and of course the Republican economic platform is just opposite to that. Parenthetically, Joe Biden seems to be betting that policies that may benefit not less educated working class voters will swing them back. I'm not sure he's going to win that bet, but it's certainly a good try. But big point is things have really changed, right? The US is just a dramatically different place now than it was in 1992. Authoritarians are deeply threatened both by social change and by media and elites who amplify that. I've showed you that a range of political attitudes are more tightly organized along an authoritarianism dimension. It's a stronger predictor of the vote, and partisanship is much more related to authoritarianism, with high authoritarians increasingly sorting into the Republican Party and away from the Democratic Party. Let me say a little bit more about partisan sorting. Because the general notion is people don't usually change their partisanship. So what's going on here? Well, we have 3 panel data sets over this period. The 2000-2004 ANES panel, the 2016-2020 ANES panel, and a big 2012-2006 YouGov panel. So we can actually look at transitions in partisanship conditional on authoritarianism. Through 2016, there's clear evidence that there is a noticeable, not flood, but noticeable movement of people who at 2000 and were Democrats in 2000 high in authoritarianism started to identify as Republicans 4 years later, and that Democrats high in authoritarianism in 2012 started to identify as Republicans 4 years later. It's not massive, but it's notable and accumulates over time. Through these 2 panels, there's no evidence that Republicans low on authoritarianism are deserting the Republican Party. So the sorting is up through 2016 appears to be asymmetric, right? Then comes 2020, and we see additional sorting of high authoritarian Democrats further into the Republican Party. But for the first time in these panels since 2000, we finally see low authoritarian Republicans start to declare that they're not Republicans. But interestingly, to a great extent, what they're saying is they're independents. They're not willing to call themselves Democrats. High authoritarian Democrats have been willing to say, I'm a Republican now, right? But at least through 2020, the 2016-2020 desertion of low authoritarian Republicans has been to be independents, not Democrats. Whether they'll keep moving or just stick in the independent column is yet to be seen. So I just want to emphasize 2 more things. This big moderating role that we've learned to expect of political involvement, at least in terms of authoritarianism, has declined sharply. The differences in connections between authoritarianism and politics between college-educated and less than college-educated voters has hugely diminished over the last 30 years. And importantly, part of what the story is of 2016-2020 is that Donald Trump not only attracted authoritarian voters, but in particular, he attracted less attentive authoritarian voters. And I think that's part of what's been missed. And I think part of what polling has missed because those are particularly hard people to find in our samples. And I want to again emphasize the effects of political leadership, right? There's a difference between not just obvious difference between Donald Trump and say Mitt Romney, but important differences in terms of the extent to which they lead people to connect certain predispositions to politics. And particularly what we're seeing now is that Trump being the Republican candidate in both 2016 and 2020 has really galvanized movement of authoritarians to the Republican Party is something that we hadn't seen before. So what does this mean for the Republican Party? So Republican Party, it seems to me, is stuck in a self-reinforcing loop, right? On the one hand, what I think we've seen is that candidates who take positions that evoke authoritarian values help to activate those in their supporters. But at the same time, as the Republican primary electorate shifts increasingly towards a higher percentage of authoritarians, they're presenting candidates. They're presenting an opportunity for more authoritarian candidates or candidates to shift their rhetoric towards that. So you now get a situation in which, you know, and we saw this in the last midterm elections, where certain candidates, authoritarian type candidates, do well in Republican primaries, reinforcing authoritarianism among Republican voters, and this is now cycle feeding on itself. It was only a little over 10 years ago that Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president. Can you imagine Mitt Romney getting the Republican nomination in the next election? I honestly don't quite know what gets the Republican Party out of this vicious cycle at this point, but it's not going to be easy. Let me just acknowledge my collaborators on this project: Chris Federico, University of Minnesota, Chris Weber, University of Arizona, and thank you for listening to all of that.
Questions first. Yeah, Don. So one really big result here is moving from 1992 to present. Parties that really sorted those votes, right? So that's really a dramatic shift.
Mm-hmm.
They were indistinguishable on average in 1992. Now they're very far apart.
Mm-hmm.
That's true. And not challenging. But it's also true that other changes have happened equally dramatic, including views on women's place, mm-hmm. which includes views on abortion, which includes racial resentment, and more. Mm-hmm. So how do you keep track of your story in the context of all these other things that are happening simultaneously? What's primary and what's secondary?
Okay. I get the big question first. So, okay, here's my answer.
Someone usually not need to ask a hard question first. Everything else is going to be solved.
Okay. So, here's my answer. I don't for a moment deny that all of those things that you just mentioned are influencing people's choice of parties, vote decisions, and the like. I think that evidence is clear on that. However, it's also the case that all of those things that you mentioned are becoming increasingly intercorrelated among themselves. That leads us to a difficult decision in terms of studying their effects, right? And the correlations by 20 are really high. I mean, if you get rid of measurement error, they're staggeringly high. So then how do you sort out the effects of racial resentment and gender attitudes and abortion and attitudes towards gay and transgender rights and et cetera, right? So two strategies, right? One, you could say, I want to distinguish the effects of all of these, so let me put them all in a model of vote choice. And now you've got massive multiclinearity, and you're going to have a terrible time getting precise estimates of any of the effects of those, right? So then you have the other option, which is you can say, I'm going to focus in on gender equality or racial resentment or something, and you think you get a good estimate of that, except now you have terrible excluded variable bias because they're correlated with everything that's left out of your equation. So I'll be honest, I don't know how to solve that problem, but it's now a big problem for analyzing cross-sectional data. So my argument is that what focusing on authoritarianism does is in some ways gives us a big picture, right? It is likely the case, well, let me put it more strongly. It's almost certainly the case that for individual voters, gender attitudes, racial attitudes, abortion attitudes, et cetera, might be more or less salient for them in making this decision. But increasingly, those are tied to authoritarianism, right? Increasingly. So in that sense, focusing in on authoritarianism sort of gives us the big picture of what the dynamics look like. And I think we can get good estimates of the effect of authoritarianism. I'm not sure that we can now get really good estimates of the effects of all those other things. So I perfectly accept that all those things that you mentioned are important and probably mediate the effects of authoritarianism. But I believe that given the difficulties of distinguishing all of those things, which people have been trying now for a while, that I think we can learn a lot about social effects of social change and candidate rhetoric on voting and attitude organization and partisanship by looking at authoritarianism, and it gives us a clean view of what's happening. And as I said, I won't argue with your list. And I'm also happy to believe that if we ran a model with authoritarianism and all of those things, that the effect of authoritarianism would go to zero. But that's okay, right? It just means that there is a core part of authoritarianism that is being conveyed by these other issues. And if somebody in this room can figure out how to get precise estimates of how much of that is due to racial resentment and how much of it is gender attitudes and how much of it's due to abortion and how much of it's due to immigration and et cetera, then please, I'd be delighted to see the result.
You have to talk to the people at ANES. They have to interview everyone. And then we'll have statistical position on that question. Actually, my question was about an earlier phenomenon, which is the sorting that I mentioned, this list of things I mentioned, can be explained, I think, in a very straightforward way about the movement of the parties.
Oh yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, no, I don't deny that. That's definitely part of the story.
And that seems like a simpler and more powerful, convincing story than the parties that separated authoritarians.
But the parties could have separated in any which way. It turns out that they have separated increasingly on authoritarianism, right? And so the interesting question is why on that, out of all the things that they could have sorted on, have they sorted massively from, as you say, no sorting at all in 1992 to massively sorting in 2020?
Yeah, your answer is more psychological. That's fine. My answer is more about parties looking for majority.
Sure. I don't think we're saying anything different. I think.
Well, I think we are.
No. No.
I'm done.
I don't think we are. I think, parties obviously look for voters, but the question is, where do they look for voters? right? And so I'm saying, I think this is where the Republican Party has increasingly been looking for voters.
Walter,
Long time no talk to you. Appreciate it, talking and all the work you've been doing on this. So my question about a little gone and implicitly, but kind of a two-parter. So you start off in your conceptual argument discussing, point out white Anglos. And I thought that was a peculiar kind of thing. I assume when you referred to Anglos, you meant to not say Jewish Americans. Is that the group you were thinking of not including? But Anglo is pretty specific. And so, for example, the Catholics on the Supreme Court are not Anglo. I remember, I think it was Mastriano running for the Senate most recently was asked as a white candidate, but he said, no, I'm not white, I'm Italian. And so I wonder whether you really mean white Anglos or other, your survey to distinguish that ethnic distinction there. So is there something special about Anglos distinguished from other whites? And is authoritarianism part of anti-Semitism? But my other question, which is related to that, is you start in '92 when you have Bill Clinton, the governor from the South, and then you go to 2000 when you do not have a governor from the South, and everyone would think that there's a big association with Southerners with authoritarianism and racism and all the other isms that some like, some don't like. But that seems to be a big movement we normally talk about in politics is Southern Americans. Jimmy Carter managed to hold on for a while. They kind of went to Ronald Reagan. They came back a little with Bill Clinton. And you don't talk about region at all. So can you say a little bit about the regional distribution, whether the nuances among whites is important to your larger conception?
Okay, so I admit to a bit of sloppiness. I'm sure, to some extent, the empirical conclusions that I can draw are constrained by the sort of data that I can talk to. And so, as I said at the beginning, this conception of authoritarianism is directly tied into a group's conception of themselves and what their group looks like, what they think the nation looks like, what their values of that group are. So yes, I suspect, although I have not looked at this, that even though we would declare them to be white, the Jews are not part of this group, and certainly for most of the white authoritarians, they would certainly not be comfortable with extending the group boundary in that direction. To some extent, this is an issue of psychological identification, right? So who identifies as a member of the group? And there are a couple of interesting papers in psychology that people as a whole when they think about the U.S., tend to think about the U.S. and this was some 15 years ago, as a white country, but in particular, white voters think that way. So, leaving aside Catholic versus Protestant and Italian versus Irish and whatever, I'm not cutting those hairs that way. It is the predominant white Christian group that this is describing, that this part of what I was talking about is describing. The southern part is interesting, and I've looked at this, and to some extent, the lack of difference in authoritarianism between the parties in 1992 was a bit of a holdover of white Southerners who hadn't quite yet deserted the party for Republicans, but not entirely, right? That's only a tiny little bit of the story. There were quite a number of non-Southern whites who scored high in authoritarianism, who were strong Democrats, identified as a Democrat, voted Democratic, and on economic policy preferences sounded like Democrats. They were more socially conservative. There's no question about that. They tended to be more socially conservative than Democrats as a whole, but they still had no problems identifying as a Democrat and voting Democratic. The one interesting comparison is, I haven't finished this analysis, but I've done a little bit of an analysis of authoritarianism in the UK surrounding the Brexit vote and then the Boris Johnson election. And before Brexit, a sizable share of Labour voters scored high in authoritarianism, and they were consistent Labour voters. And then Brexit came along and they started to peel off, right? And then Boris Johnson comes along and then they massively desert the Labour Party. You know, depending upon how politics, what's salient and how the parties align, right, is going to affect the distribution of authoritarians. Authoritarians historically, right, have been comfortable in left-wing social democratic parties, right? This is not unusual, and it becomes a problem when the political agenda shifts from social welfare type issues and egalitarianism issues to immigration, to social change, to gender issues and the like, and then that match that fit between authoritarians and more left-wing parties becomes problematic.
At some level, my ulterior motive is to add SDO to Don's list and get your reaction to that. But I want to phrase it a different way. I want to try to understand the affective topography of this. If I think about your measurement, which is definitely an improvement, but it's at its heart, it's still the same sort of fear, would you agree, as what Fromm would have talked about, what Adorno et al. Would have talked about. And what's missing is maybe the anger. And what strikes me about what basically Trump was able to effect in 2016 in particular was we get those pearl-clutching, fearful, church-going, moralistic authoritarians, but also those Harley-riding, angry biker gangs to sort of come out and show up for him. So where's the role of anger? I don't know that that's embodied by SDO, but in my mind, they have something to do with one another.
So, you know, I'm going to be the last person to say that the only thing we need to pay attention to is authoritarianism when we understand the world. That would be ridiculous, right? And there are certainly other elements at work as well. And I don't think there's any question that some very loud elements of the far right are not being motivated by authoritarianism, but more by this sort of social dominance orientation that Sedanius and Prado had advanced. And I think that's almost certainly true. The interesting thing about what I think a political leader can do in terms of authoritarianism is, and I think this is an important part of my understanding of emotions, right? So you're highly authoritarian and you start seeing, you go to the supermarket and people are speaking Spanish, right? And you hear from your children that one of their classmates now changed their gender, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think the first reaction is anxiety, right? Something is wrong, but it seems uncontrollable, right? And so you feel anxious, right? What turns that into anger is a political leader who comes along and says, these people are responsible for it, right? It's those Democrats, it's those liberals who are bringing these people into this country, who are encouraging their kids to change their gender, who are upsetting business practices with affirmative action. And then people say, now they have a target, right? And now that, and what had been anxiety is now anger, and then you can mobilize anger. So I think I keep in the back of my mind is to study that dynamic, but I think that is exactly what right-wing leaders do, is to convince people that there is a target that explains why things are changing. It's not uncontrollable, right? It's not just stuff is happening, but it is those people who are doing it, and you should get angry at them. And I don't have any evidence of that, but I believe that that's part of the story.
So I'm kind of going back to your measure, and you're saying that this is, and I agree, that's a good measure because it's what we transmit to children. So I guess I'm asking, really, like, where does authoritarianism come from? And essentially, is it socialized, right? And from that perspective, I don't know if I'm taking it like too many steps down. Would we expect higher rates of authoritarianism if it's socialized under conditions of threat? So among people who are socializing their kids right now, who are ostensibly under threat, are they more likely to create authoritarianism?
I will preface my answer by saying that I don't think anybody fully understands the ideology of authoritarianism. If you believe the results of twin studies, it is highly heritable. That doesn't explain it, but it does suggest that there is some deeper predisposition that that leads to authoritarianism. And it is most closely related personality-wise with the dimension of openness to experience. So people low in openness to experience tend to be high in authoritarianism. In my mind, I think because if you're low in openness to experience, then seeing diversity and change around you is threatening, right? So there are some strong, probably dispositional factors. There's some evidence that education reduces authoritarianism. The problem is that most of that evidence is correlational. And so as much as I would like to believe that education can reduce authoritarianism, I'm agnostic about whether or not to believe that it's really a causal effect of education rather than people low in authoritarianism selecting into higher education. But that is one possibility. I'm not sure that there's actually evidence that growing up in a threatening environment would increase authoritarianism. It's a plausible hypothesis. I don't know that there's any evidence of that at the moment. The other thing that could be happening, and if anything, what we're seeing at the moment is that younger people are lower in authoritarianism. And I suspect that that is to some extent a function of the fact that younger people are growing up in a more diverse society. They're going to schools that are more diverse. They're on social media and they're encountering a wider range of people and views, and they're just more comfortable with that. So if anything, they're somewhat more comfortable with diversity as a result of that, and that might be having effect from, I haven't finished this analysis, but looking at the 2016 to 2020 ANES, there's actually, over those 4 years, within subjects has been a slight decline in authoritarianism. If you look at people over 30, nothing, right? If you look at the youngest generation, it looks like over those 4 years, authoritarianism has gone down a bit. But that's a tentative finding. As I say, I don't think we have a good enough either model or data yet to be able to pin down exactly what the determinants of authoritarianism are to fully answer your question. I wish I could.
Okay, we'll go with one more question. I know there's a number of hands here. Mata, do you want to say something? Sorry.
Thanks again for coming. You suggested at the beginning of the talk that you did look at this a little bit about how it might operate among Black or Latino voters. And I was wondering if you could say anything about that. Do you see the same patterns emerge? Or is there something different?
In authoritarianism among non-white. So,
Mhm.
okay, that's interesting. So there's variance in authoritarianism in all groups, including African Americans, including Latinos. What we find is that if you look at religious and social values, attitudes on gay rights, on transgender attitudes, on abortion, things like that, that the effects of authoritarianism among white Americans, African Americans, and Latinos is virtually indistinguishable. Right? The story gets more interesting when you look at attitudes about immigration, diversity, and attitudes on race. Right? And here's where the groupishness of authoritarianism comes in, because those things are highly threatening to whites, but they're not threatening to authoritarians. Right? Now, I want to qualify that I'm not saying that immigration may not be threatening to working class members of minority groups, but that's an economic threat. Right? They're not threatening in terms of threatening social cohesion and diversity. So what we find is that the effect of authoritarianism on those on immigration attitudes, on diversity, on attitudes towards race, is strong among whites and completely absent among African Americans and Latinos. So that's part of the story. And again, it makes sense when you think about how members of social groups high in authoritarianism are basically reacting to group level threats to cohesion. And in some respects, those are similar across group lines, but for other sorts of threats, they're dramatically different. And so paradoxically, one last point, there's obviously not a whole lot of variance in partisanship among African Americans in the US, but the extent that it is, authoritarianism among African Americans is actually positively related to voting Democratic, right? Because that's a strong intergroup norm, I think is the argument. It's not much of an effect, but it does go in the opposite direction from whites. Higher authoritarianism among Blacks, it reinforces democratic voting and democratic identification, which is consistent with the group norm for them.
All right, everybody. Thanks to Stanley.